Hello everyone, this is the presentation on the Persian Gulf War, written, produced, edited, supervised, and directed by Jacob Deco. Let's start with some quick fact appetizers for this entree of information. The Persian Gulf War began on August 2nd, 1990, and ended on February 28th, 1991. The Gulf War is commonly referred to as Operation Desert Storm. However, Desert Storm was only a small section of the war and was preceded by Operation Desert Shield. Desert Shield's primary function was to organize the coalition forces from countries such as Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Their purpose was to protect Saudi Arabia from invasion by Iraq and to prepare to enter Kuwait to expunge Iraqi forces. Desert Storm's primary objective was to use aircraft to initiate a preliminary strike on Iraqi forces and then use ground troops to remove them from Kuwait. One thing to remember is that the Soviet Union is as a power and influence at this time, and the Berlin Wall has just barely fallen in November of 1989. Iraq sided with the USSR during the Cold War. Consequently, the bulk of their weaponry was designed and manufactured by the Soviet Union, such as the MiG-25, the T-72, and the Astro-2. Thus, the Gulf War gave the United States a good perspective on the caliber of Soviet engineering. Now, let's introduce the leaders involved in the Middle East. First, we have Saddam Hussein, ruler of Iraq. Next, we have a gentleman with a particularly hard to pronounce name, so for now we'll just call him the King of Kuwait. Finally, we have King Fahd, ruler of Saudi Arabia. To start at the beginning of the Cold War, we need to consider the war between Iraq and Iran from 1980 to 1988. During the war, Iraq was in desperate need of money in order for victory to even remain a possibility. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait decided to help Iraq by sending about $60 billion of financial aid, believing that that money would be repaid. Once the Iran-Iraq War concluded, however, Saddam Hussein began making accusations against Kuwait. At the time, there were many valuable oil fields located on the border of Kuwait and Iraq. Hussein confronted Kuwait, stating that they were taking more than their fair share. He also claimed that Kuwait, Iran, and Saudi Arabia were conspiring to keep oil prices low for other countries like the United States, thus wounding Iraq's economy. Because of this, Hussein refused to recognize the $30 billion of debt owed to Kuwait and stationed 100,000 troops on the Iraq-Kuwait border in July of 1990. This aggressive military action created tension between Iraq and Kuwait, but with a meager 20,000 soldier army, Kuwait was in no position to repel the placement of such a massive force. On August 2nd, 1990, at 2 a.m., after having reinforced his border armies, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, striking the northern and eastern borders along with the capital, Kuwait City. Kuwait, unprepared for the assault, quickly tried to rally its troops. Although courageous, they were quickly destroyed in a wave of steel and fire. By the end of the day, almost the entire country had fallen to Iraq. Initially, the United States firmly stated its neutrality on the conflict between Iraq and Kuwait when Hussein placed troops on the Iraq-Kuwait border in July. On July 25, 1990, April Glaspie, the United States ambassador for Iraq, said to Saddam, "I know you need funds. We understand that, and our opinion is that you should have the opportunity to rebuild your country. But we have no opinion on the Arab conflicts, like your border disagreement with Kuwait. Frankly, we can only see that you have deployed massive troops in the south." However, as soon as Kuwait was invaded, President George H.W. Bush expressed his disdain for Hussein's decision. He said, "Within 3 days, 120,000 Iraqi troops with 850 tanks have poured into Kuwait and moved south to threaten Saudi Arabia. It was then that I decided to act to check that aggression." He also said, "Most countries share a concern for principle, and many have a stake in the stability of the Persian Gulf. This is not, as Saddam Hussein would have it, the United States against Iraq. It is Iraq against the world." The United States wasn't the only country that condemned the invasion of Kuwait. The very same day as the invasion, the United Nations held a council and issued Resolution 660, stating that Iraq should leave Kuwait immediately. In addition, countries that traditionally sided with Iraq, such as France and India, expressed their disapproval and urged them to exit Kuwait. Countries like China and the USSR even enacted trade embargoes for weapons and arms for Iraq. After Hussein did not withdraw his forces, the United Nations issued Resolution 678, stating that if Hussein's troops were not withdrawn by January 15, 1991, then the coalition force, led by General Norman Schwarzkopf, would use all means necessary to remove Iraqi forces. Military party, everyone's invited. Okay, not everyone, but in all honesty, nearly every major world power, to some degree, expressed their disapproval for Hussein's actions. Because of this, a coalition force was created as part of Operation Desert Shield. Permission was granted by King Fahd to allow the conglomerate troops to be placed in Saudi Arabia to protect them from a potential invasion. This world map shows the number of troops that were given to the coalition from each country. Notice how Iraq, the yellow country, is the only country on their side. Eventually, January 15th came around, and Saddam Hussein was still controlling Kuwait and intended to stay, having already instituted new leaders and policies. Consequently, Operation Desert Storm was initiated. Aircraft and Scud missiles were used to subdue the Iraqi forces and prep them for a ground assault. The airstrike started in January and continued to February 24th. Aircraft and laser-guided missiles proved to be extremely effective in Desert Storm. This was because the Iraqi defenses were not very sophisticated and were often located in the middle of a desert, making them easy targets. Laser-guided missiles, like the Scud missile, were also crucial because it allowed for precision strikes on enemy bases located near civilian towns. It wasn't perfect, but it was much better than previous missiles. Once air superiority was achieved, ground troops began marching in on February 24th. The ground troops met minimal resistance because the Iraqi defenses were so badly destroyed. In fact, just 4 days later, Kuwait had been liberated and the enemy forces had been removed, concluding the Persian Gulf War on February 28, 1991. And that is the Persian Gulf War. Thanks for watching.